Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to another layout design video. This design is for an HO scale railroad in a fairly generous space. It's more or less square and about 1,000 square feet. So a good sized space, but even so, the client wanted to fit quite a lot into it, so we still had to be careful with the usage. In this first slide, we can see two possible layout extents, depending on whether or not the client wanted to leave the windows open, because he hadn't confirmed that in his original brief. There's three doors close together. This one here is a closet, the one in the middle is the room entry, and this one leads to a long narrow bathroom in the corner. There is a set of glass sliding doors out onto a patio, and there are four large windows, one in the west and three in the north. The red line shows the limit of what can be used for the railroad if the windows can be blocked, and the faint purple line shows how much of the room has to be left clear if he wants the windows to be accessible. He wrote back and said he didn't care about blocking the windows, but he did want a little more space in the entry area. In the next drawing of the room, I've shown a 5-foot clear entry space, and also in this drawing the doors go the wrong way. He mentioned they all went the same way, and I drew them this way because it's normal to have doors opening into closets and bathrooms. It's very rare to have them opening outwards, but it turns out they all open into the room, and that's the reason why he wanted the 5-foot wide open space by the entry. Anyway, as with all my layout designs, once I have an accurate drawing of the room, the next step is to work out the most efficient layout footprint. This is what I came up with first. We talked at some length about what he wanted in the room. Big staging yard, preferably on the same level as the rest of the railroad. He didn't want a helix. He wanted the grades to be no more than 1.5%. He wanted big curves, at least 3-foot radius, and more would be better. Fairly long trains, 2 yards, one larger and one smaller. And he wanted space for a workbench, which I thought this was probably a good spot for it. As his preference was to keep the staging yard on the same level as the rest of the railroad, my first thought was to put the main yard along the long straight wall at the top of the plan with a staging yard behind it and a narrow access aisle behind that. And that would also have the effect of providing natural light into this area, as opposed to putting it on the east wall where we wouldn't get that benefit. Actually, as soon as I finished drawing this, I realized there was a better arrangement for the upper reaches of the plan. By moving the staging yard against the wall and leaving the access aisle in the middle, not only can we widen this curve and get curved turnouts in both corners with better access, thus making the staging tracks longer, but the access aisle also allows us to access the rear of the engine terminal, eliminating the need for pop-up access in that area. Anyway, after I sent the client this plan, he wrote back that he didn't really like it. I don't remember the reason, but I do remember that we started talking about another layout that I had recently finished designing, which seemed to have a lot in common with what he wanted, and it might be possible to adapt it to fit his room. Here is the other layout I was talking about, superimposed on the client's layout room. Now, the original version wouldn't have fitted, so I had to flip the plan left to right, and as we can see, it does indeed fit in the room comfortably. Now, there are a lot of changes that are needed. For one thing, the client wanted a double track main line, bigger curves, and longer trains. And of course, all those adjustments will take up more space, but even so, I felt there was a good chance that this plan could be adapted to suit this client's needs. Here is the next drawing, with the main elements of that plan adapted to fit the client's space. The main yard is in the same place. The small yard is in about the same place in the room, but it's on the main line instead of on the branch line. And the main line goes all the way around the peninsula instead of stopping short. And because we're not going to be able to put a helix under the engine terminal in this corner, I needed the rest of the space of the room to add a small peninsula to get that turn back curve and allow some running length to get down to the staging. Of course, at this point, the client has now abandoned his ideals of having the staging yard on the main level, and of course it will be below the main yard and the river scene. Here is a later version. I've changed the shape of the benchwork in this area The main reason for that being I didn't have enough length of run between the main yard and the staging yard below it to get down far enough with an acceptable grade. So we do need this peninsula to be widened at both ends so that we can make a single lap of this peninsula to lose some elevation. And although technically it is a one lap helix, the lap is long enough that there is a lot more space between the two levels of it, and the client was okay with that. In this plan I have included a few place names. The client wanted his main yard to be called Roseville and his small yard to be called Sparks. He also later mentioned that he wanted the branch terminal to be called Delta, although at this stage I didn't have that name. I don't know where I came up with Upper and Lower Langsford, but I wanted to show that it represents the same town, just being served by two different railroads at different elevations, hence the names Upper and Lower. That gave us the opportunity for local trains on both routes to have some industries to switch without cluttering up the railroad with any more towns than necessary, because the client wanted a long, unencumbered, scenic run through a mountainous area. He also had a mine diorama that was already built that he wanted to incorporate if possible, and I felt that this location right in the middle of the room was probably going to be the best place for it, even though we both knew that it was going to have to be adapted somewhat. The engine terminal here is simply copied and pasted from another design. It's not meant to be the final version. I just wanted to get a feel for how much engine terminal was possible in this space. Now here is my first design of the staging level. We can see we have the single lap of this helix allowing us to get down to minus 18-inch elevation, main staging in the corner and some auxiliary staging stub tracks along this straight wall. This corner looks like an opportunity for spare locomotive storage, and just as I always like to do on my staging yards, there is the possibility of getting reverse loops in both directions. And that was a feature the client was really happy to see, because he wasn't sure if I was going to be able to arrange that. Also shown in this drawing is the arrangement for a moving workstation. This work table here is drawn at 2 feet by 5 feet, and although this is a good place to use it, it can't stay there when the railroad's in operation because this narrow access aisle is completely cut off. And as there's a carpet in this room, moving a workbench around on casters is a little bit hit and miss. You're likely to be bumping into table legs and all sorts of things. So rather than put casters in all 4 corners, I felt it'd be a better idea to have one corner hinged onto a benchwork leg and just put casters in the other 3 corners. That way you can just close it like a gate and open it again for use. I probably should have mentioned earlier, in this corner of the room the client wanted a seating area. I drew a 2-seater couch in there. There wasn't room for a 3-seater because this door was too close to the end wall, but 2 seats and a couch was enough. The client told me that he had some tall bar stools and a small round table that he was going to put there instead, which didn't take up much room at all. But I decided to leave it drawn as a couch because that took up more space, and by making sure there was sufficient space in front of it, the client still had options both ways. Anyway, this next drawing is a later rendition of the staging level. You can see that I have now moved the staging yard to the end wall. With the curved ladders in the corners, we can very conveniently use pinwheel ladders made of number 6 turnouts, with all the curves going the same way so there are no reverse curve issues. It also allowed for better balancing of the grades at both ends and longer auxiliary staging tracks. Moving back to the upper deck now, the first area that I drew in detail was the small yard at Sparks. And in this location I wanted to try to find enough industry and enough traffic to justify terminating a couple of locals here, running as turns from the main yard. And with that in mind, I started by using a good portion of the available industry space for a single large industry that could conceivably originate several dozen cars per day. And I also put in a small interchange yard with another railroad. And of course those tracks could be filled up and emptied multiple times per day, allowing for a pretty much unlimited car supply at this yard. If we go back to the previous version, here we can see that I got a reasonable length on those interchange tracks. I think each will take about 10 or 12 cars. As the client wants his railroad set in the transition area, we decide that trains that terminate at Sparks are going to be diesel hauled, eliminating the need for a turntable. Especially as we decided we wanted a turntable at the terminal yard as well, and 3 turntables on the visible portion would probably have been excessive. So we have just a small diesel house here. I would have preferred to have just put in a single refueling track, but the client wanted a 2-track engine house here. Also in this plan we can see that I've got industry tracks crossing each other, both here and in this location. The client specifically told me early on in the process that he wanted his industrial spurs to cross each other in several places. He'd already told me that he wanted to use Atlas and Pico Code 100 track. He already had a large quantity of Code 100 and he actually liked the appearance of it, even though he is fully aware that it's overscale. While looking through the track libraries for Atlas Code 100 track, I found they had a good range of different angles of diamond crossing, so I was able to get 3 different ones on this single spur, a 19, a 25 and a 30, crossing 3 spurs that radiate out in the opposite direction. So I sketched that in, and the client actually loved that area. So that's absolutely fantastic, just what he was looking for. So that stayed. In this next version I've filled in the engine terminal and the main yard. I've also managed to get a passenger station at the end of this aisle. Curving the main passenger track round a 180-degree curve is not ideal, but it was the only way that we were going to get in a long track for his 16-car mainline passenger train without using up a lot of space that he wanted to keep available for the main yard. The only comment he made on this design was that he was disappointed on the length of the yard. He was hoping it could be longer. So I tried experimenting with different combinations of curved turnouts in the corner of the room. Here's the next version. I was able to add about 3 feet to the length of each yard track without unduly compromising the alignment of the curves. And this the client felt was more satisfactory. I've drawn in another place where industry spurs could cross each other at this point, even though it's a little bit repetitive, and he agreed with me that it's probably best not to bother unless it gave us significant advantages. In this design I've also roughed in one possible arrangement for the branch line yard, and I've shown his mine diorama. As I already mentioned, we always knew it was going to have to be modified. For one thing, the tracks did not extend past the loader anywhere near far enough, so he wanted to extend it in that direction and also add at least one storage track in front of it. Now, because the original diorama was designed to fit in a 90-degree corner, it didn't really work very well here without wasting a lot of space. And it turns out the easiest way to modify it is to basically cut it in half, rotate the rock face that goes across the end of it by about 60 degrees, and that leaves room to extend the 2 spurs. And then we'll just have to add another little bit of scenery in the middle of it. Anyway, with most of the track now filled in, I turned my attention to this area around the branch line yard. And it turns out that there is plenty of elevation difference at this point to double deck this portion of the railroad. And although this was not something that the client asked for, I suggested it to him, pointing out that it would add about an extra 20 feet of visible mainline run. Here is the first drawing that I did with the double decking in mind. I've split the backdrop around this area to allow plenty of space for wide supports between them that can securely support the upper deck. And I showed him the extra mainline run that it gives him. And here's what we can now do on the upper deck. Since the length of the yard at Delta is no longer severely restricted as it was before, we can put the engine terminal in the corner and we can extend the main line around the end curve to another much larger mine. And this I felt gave the branch line a much better reason for its existence, since we're now assuming that it was largely built to serve this mine. The smaller mine we already had isn't really large enough to justify that. In theory, I could have extended the upper deck the whole length of Sparks Yard, but I refrained from doing so. I felt that the added benefit of extending the upper deck did not justify restricting the viewing of the yard below it. Anyway, once the client understood how the double decking worked, he really liked the idea. It gave him a little bit more railroad in the space. And at this point the design is almost done, although there's still a few details to fill in, and the industrial spurs in Roseville are still just placeholders. Here is a later version, and I think at this point all the track has been included. I've filled in all the industries in and around Roseville. You can see here I deleted the crossing. And I've also detailed Delta Yard a bit, added the industries, improved the engine terminal. Note the difference in design philosophies for the main and branch yards. On both the main line yards, we have lead tracks at both ends of the yards, clear of the main line, whereas in Delta, it's a short line, so switching is done directly on the main line, because they would not have gone to the expense of adding extra turnouts to provide a dedicated yard lead. Similarly, with the engine terminal, the large terminal at Roseville has several lead tracks onto the turntable, whereas the terminal at Sparks, since it's only going to be servicing 2 or 3 locomotives a day, it just has one lead track onto the turntable and a single spur with separate spots for sand, coal and ash, being very much a minimal steam locomotive service area. Here is one more view of the staging level. When I recalculated the grades, I found that I didn't need such a long lead to the reversing loop at this end, so I was able to rearrange the auxiliary staging, going in one more long track and a short spur in this corner for storing the client's track cleaning train. That's something that I've recently started to include on layout designs. In this view, I've showed the best route for the return loop, keeping the track accessible and avoiding restricting the clearance for the river bridge. Note the reversing loop is significantly below all the other trackage here. Here is the main level with all the scenery filled in. Please feel free to pause it if you want a longer look. Here is the lower level, also completed. In this corner I moved one turnout from this location around to the end. It gives better access. This piece of disconnected track is still shown as a comparison. Something else you can see in this view is the outline of the work table in its stored location, showing how it fits neatly under the benchwork and can just be wheeled out for use. Let me go back to the main level again. Leave that slide up and I will sign off here. Hope you enjoyed this video, found it useful or interesting or both, and I hope to see you back next week. In the meantime, thanks for watching and bye for now.